If your accuracy rate is 90%, that sounds really great. But I don't know that in 100 answers, it would be acceptable to have 10 life safety screw ups, from sort of an AI engine. The way that we've looked at this, I think, through an AI tool it is cabined to just looking at our codes and standards, our commentary materials. Again, it is pressure tested by our technical experts. So this is called our AI Navigator.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I have a really special guest, Gabe Mazer. He's the Executive Vice President of Innovation and Growth at the International Code Council. If you ever pulled a permit, gone through a home inspection, you've been living inside the Code Council's work, whether you knew it or not, for many of the things we take for granted, including our day-to-day safety. In addition to standards, they've also built some incredible technology, specifically digital codes, and an ecosystem making really the standards accessible for most folks. Gabe got here through an unusual route. Gabe, if I believe I get this correct, a biology degree, then law school, Capitol Hill, financing home retrofits, and all the above. So really excited to kind of dig in there. But Gabe, thanks for joining.
Jose, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate your show and the opportunity to be with you.
Gabe, my instinct here is that you're going to be way too modest about, I think, some of the work you're working on, but it's not lost on me, both the scale at which, the work impacts the country here. I want to dive in to double click. I know on socials, we kind of lose some of this nuance, but you had put out that, building codes aren't what make a house expensive. I know there's back and forth about, more regulations make housing more expensive. Unpack that for the listener. What might we be missing, and what are some of the considerations where we should know about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with this question, there are a couple different layers. And we kind of talked about this before we kicked off. There's this nuance, so do codes have a cost? If so, to who and when? When we talk about costs, and I suspect this is where you were going, and I think where most people go, we're talking about price. So will an updated code that has stronger resilience provisions increase the price of a home for a consumer? And the answer to that question is emphatically no. And that's per a recently released University of Alabama study. They looked at 45 state adoptions of the International Residential Code across 26 states, 2.7 million home sales, found no measurable link between updated codes and home prices.
And real quick, just to understand that, an example of that, is it that most folks might think, because of codes requiring certain upgrades, people just think it's going to be more expensive? Is that kind of what is the typical assumption?
That's certainly a narrative that's out there, that that one sort of, as codes advance with technology and best practices, new requirements are going to increase the cost of construction, and that those costs will necessarily be borne by a homeowner. And I think there are a couple sort of better assumptions that are kind of like built into that narrative. But the biggest, and this is really important, is as a consumer, can we afford to be building and buying new homes that advance with technology and lessons learned after disaster? And the answer is yes, because it turns out that there are so many factors that go into setting a price that a home ultimately sells for. Building codes are these researchers at the University of Alabama, and they're not alone. I mean, their research builds on several other studies out there. Codes are not what's affecting the price. What they said was actually a lot more likely are things that you'd expect. It's the size of the home, its location, it's the ratios of bedrooms and bathrooms. It's those features. It's not the attributes, the life safety pieces that current codes.
You're on the front lines of something that most of us would consider to be almost unsurmountable, right? You're dealing with codes of buildings that we all live into. How moving from the policy side to now product position, can you give us insight into the level of complexity, or perhaps just what are the things that you have to consider? I mean, you've got, maybe taking the life of how do you introduce a single new line of code? What needs to be true from that moment to actually, distributing this across local municipalities, enforcing this? Perhaps give us some sense as to what kind of feedback do you get in the first place to even, like, what are you staring at here?
I think this is It's a great question. Sort of the challenges with the mechanics of codes and standards development is it's sort of premised on someone submitting a code change. So this thing sort of exists, the code exists, and to change it, someone has to proactively submit something to change. And what do you do if there's an important change that the industry is talking about or that technology is enabled, but the constituency for that change hasn't worked in the code development space before, doesn't know how to plug in. And so that's something I've watched for a while, something I see a huge opportunity to ensure that, codes and standards, and this is kind of part of the new role that I'm in, is ensuring that our codes and standards and products keep pace with where the industry needs them to be. So the way that we'll do this is we can be purposefully proactive about facilitating consensus building on critical topics for our industry. And so that ensures that these pieces are heard, that the folks that have this knowledge are read into the process, know how to engage, know how to talk to experts at how different code provisions across different disciplines interact, so that you don't have unforeseen consequences from an update in sort of one area that has downstream effect somewhere else. And so we're doing this in a number of interesting areas. We just launched earlier this year development of a guideline on data centers, and what we had seen, and this is an industry that's exploded in growth. We were seeing a sort of a constellation of different requirements for different aspects of the data center. Sort of energy use is here, and cooling is here, and fire protection is here, but there was no high level document that could pull all of these different pieces together and make sure that they're all integrated and working sort of across disciplines. And so that's an effort that's ongoing in our. We're working on middle housing, which is a major sort of area of focus in the policy space. It's identified as a way to generate more housing to address shortfalls at lower costs, and there are concerns about ensuring that codes are effectively facilitating that housing. There are concerns about ensuring that zoning best practices facilitate that housing. And so we are working on capturing sort of best practices for middle housing, both sort of in the code, but also we write a zoning code. So what are some zoning best practices that can better facilitate, not just middle housing, but affordable housing more broadly? So ADUs or offsite construction or manufactured housing close to mass transit. We've seen recent opportunities, and I know we'll have an opportunity to talk about some new things in the 27 codes, but we've got through sort of proactive consensus building provisions in there that provide best practices for how to establish an offsite construction program for a state that might not have one. So this is construction that is undertaken, not on the site, not stick-built construction, not construction that is built to the HUD code, so not manufactured homes. But these are homes that are built in a factory that meet exactly the same residential code as the stick-built home next to them, but they're just assembled in a factory. And because they are, you get these enormous savings in speed, because you can lay the foundation at the same time that you're building a home in the factory. Greater precision, significantly less material waste. And so there's some really interesting benefits for affordability, benefits for sustainability, productivity that can come out of that. Now the codes address that. They capture these new sort of methodologies around water reuse, and how can we safely, in sort of a fit for purpose manner, enable reclaimed, reused water, more of that, so that we're drawing down less. And water availability, it used to be just a concern in the West. Now it's a concern across the country. And so that's another piece, and we work together to build some consensus to encourage people to be part of it. And that process, sort of ensuring that best practices make their way into the codes, helps to demonstrate, the relevance of why should a policymaker bother to update these updated codes in the first place. And the consensus building that happens in seeing those provisions come in also helps ensure that they're pressure tested, that the different industries that are going to have opinions on sort of how those things can be implemented in the field. Architects, for example, and the design community, builders, engineers, materials manufacturers, they're all sort of part of that process alongside code officials. And so if this process, works the way that it's supposed to, ideally, when it comes time to, okay, here's a new code or here's a new provision that's coming in, and it's up to jurisdictions, right? Because we don't write codes that become the law everywhere. We write model codes, and they only become the law if a jurisdiction with the authority to adopt a code who says, yeah, we're going to choose to adopt some of those best practices. And so our job is to ensure that they really are, and that process is as seamless as possible for the code official that is taking time away from permitting to run sort of an adoption update process, and so that when the AEC community is learning, hey, there's going to be a new updated code, they're excited about what's in there because there's going to be some new benefits that make their jobs easier.
When I consider again the scale and diversity that you and your team are working with, to me, it's a little bit insane. Like, across context, geographies, sectors. You talked about modular housing, but you also talked about data centers. I mean, it's broad. As excited as I am to get into 2027, real quick, talk to me a little bit about the process of like getting feedback, right? So from previous code, what is that feedback as you're gathering feedback from different states, different sectors, political considerations, safety considerations? For someone who might think code and think big binders of stuff, is there a mental model that you could provide us to help us understand just what goes on into this consideration to even begin thinking about what to update?
Yeah, I love that question because I guess what it's trying to do is say, all right, at the end of this process, there's this book, or or a couple different books depending on the discipline. Why is there this book? Why does it look the way that it does, and why should anyone care about it? And that book reflects best practices for life safety. So it is constantly evolving to meet our improved understanding of hazard risk. And so, for instance, the 27 codes have incorporated a 500-year floodplain. So previously, the way that codes deal with disasters, it's on risk recurrence intervals. And we had previously been on a 100-year floodplain. So that's like 1% chance every year that there's flood. And in those areas that have that risk, there are additional sort of flood mitigation requirements. And it's really important because flood costs American homeowners the most out of any sort of risk ever, because you've got riverine flood, and the inside of the country, you've got coastal flooding, that occurs. And what the science was showing is that increasingly insurance claims are coming up outside of that 100-year floodplain, like most of them or many of them. And that 100-year floodplain, are maps that are describing it, and given sort of, the changes that are happening with weather patterns, that might not be the best measure. And so, if our job is to protect a homeowner that's going to put down, make the most important purchase of their life, don't we owe it to them to ensure that it's not going to suffer irreparable damage, within 10 years or something? They'll never be able to come back. So that's a good example of kind of advancements that we're seeing in post-disaster environments that led to a code change. Another area is wildland urban interface. This is another one where you see wildfires are increasing in frequency, severity, duration. It's not just a Western United States problem anymore. You're seeing fires expanding in other parts of the East. And so how do we deal with that? So we have a wildland urban interface code. And as science advances, and sometimes it's science, sometimes it's new technologies, but it's also post-disaster damage assessment. So FEMA will send these mitigation assessment teams, these MAP teams. NIST does it too, National Institute for Standards and Technology under Commerce. And what are lessons learned after one of these tragedies? Pressure differentials that increase the risk of like a more whole-scale collapse. And so if one of these, if the load is not carried from X weak point all the way down to the foundation, we're in trouble. And so if you see something in the post-disaster damage assessment that's an issue, that will make its way into code, so that maybe fasteners are recommended to be installed in a different way or more frequently in a different pattern. In the WUI space, the wildland urban interface space, not only are you seeing sort of this increased risk, you're also seeing, it's because we're growing, we're building into these spaces. And so, we're building into spaces that have greater risk. And so we need to be able to do that safely. And so we'll see greater protections for ember resistant construction so that eaves and soffits, but not just eaves and soffits, under stairs are not accidentally sort of seeing these embers that can fly for miles and miles away from the fire front, get underneath stairs and then cause harm to a building, or looking at sort of the defensible space around the building. What are those best practices so that certain types of vegetation don't go up and cause a fire, or if you're stacking your wood too close to your home, or you got a wood fence, things like that. So those are the improvements that are coming by definition, code addition to code addition. But it's not just sort of on the disaster resilience piece. I think we are very much focused. You talked about what are the the different constituencies and that have interests in this process in these books, and how does that bear on the outcome? Ensuring construction costs are kept to a minimum, that every code change is sort of as cost effective as possible is a major priority. And our codes all require statements with backing about sort of what are the cost effects, and what are your citations for the analysis that you're putting in. So there's pressure testing on this stuff, so that because you could build all all steel homes or all concrete homes, but if the cost doesn't work for folks in that region, or then that's not necessarily sort of a best practice either. So we've got to figure out what's the best way to do it. And so those are hard. And I think the middle housing pieces, an area that affordable housing advocates are strongly supportive of, developer support. The architectural community wants to see additional ways to facilitate infill housing, middle housing. There is a code change that sort of made its way into the new book that's going to address some of that. Sort of increases the maximum height where you can have sort of single egress in a building, but it does it alongside a number of important sort of life safety considerations, talking about sort of travel distance. What's the maximum that can be from someone that's on this floor to make their way out, ensuring that we're not going to have a bunch of EVs like e-scooters or e-bikes, in the stairwell that in New York City, for example, have caught on fire and caused fires. And you can't have that. If that's your only egress, we probably shouldn't have that at the base of that stairwell. So those considerations are sort of baked in, but it's advancing additional sort of design flexibility to facilitate middle housing. So that piece is in here too. Data centers, the new codes, before the 27 codes, practitioners, code officials were having a hard time, or we're not given guidance through the codes on how to characterize these structures. So are they a factory? Are they a factory that has hazardous conditions or moderate hazard conditions? Should you treat it as an office space? As an architect, there are these different classifications in the building code, and how a building is classified has these sort of second order effects on how many bathrooms does it have? What are the life safety considerations? How many people are probably working there? And so by providing additional direction there, we can ensure that it's an occupancy classification that is properly right-sized for those facilities, so that you're not over or under building. And this is an important one for practitioners. We want to do our best to eliminate confusion in the marketplace. We know that differing opinions from different jurisdictions, or different plan reviewers or inspectors, that's a friction point. And so if we can do a better job about providing certainty through the codes on some of these open questions, that's another really important part of what the codes are doing in addition to.
For those anxiously awaiting what they can expect on that 2027 code, talk to us. What's going live? You've already alluded to some major considerations around flooding and a variety of different sectors like data centers that are special considerations here. What can we expect?
So, I think a couple of the codes are already up. I think we're hoping to have the rest of them live by the end of the year. And so I talked about flood protections. I talked about facilitating modular housing. Given some of the tragic events that have happened throughout the world with seismic events, there's a new provision in there. This is a great success story. Started with sort of a FEMA guideline document that again was informed by their sort of post-disaster damage assessments about how can we cost effectively retrofit a home to make it safer, to better mitigate it against the most common ways that buildings fail following an earthquake event. And so that was eventually turned into a consensus standard with ICC. It's now referenced in the 27 building code. So that's a great new sort of design tool. And normally, if you pull a permit for an existing building, unless there's an existing building code which covers it, you're kind of having to build back to current code requirements. And if there's a way to do it better, if there's a way to sort of, build to current requirements or make this building stronger, more cost effectively, if there are some things you cannot do that are not necessary to achieve those same protections, that's what we should be encouraging. And that's exactly what those new retrofit standards do. There's a couple new ones. There's salvage lumber. I mean, there's sort of interest in reducing construction waste. And so there's new provisions about how to safely use salvage lumber. Looking at some of these other ones, given advancements with lithium ion batteries, energy storage systems, there's a whole new section in our fire code that deals with the full battery life cycle, looking at battery research and testing and manufacturing and recycling so that charging can be done safely, operations are safe in different types of buildings. I mentioned water reuse, and that's a big and important one given the Legionella challenges that New York City has faced. There are new provisions in the 27 plumbing code that incorporate best practices for building water management programs. There are additional pieces that improve sort of accessibility for people with disabilities through the plumbing code as well, so that people with disabilities and their caregivers have options, particularly when they're traveling and they need to visit a restroom. We talked about wildfires. There's strengthened ventilation requirements and best practices. There's new provisions that deal with hydrogen blending, as folks are looking to blend in hydrogen, for example, with natural gas for different uses. So, and I mentioned some of the different pieces that we incorporated around our wildland urban interface code. So, it's kind of a snapshot of a couple. We'll have some materials out that kind of hit all the highlights a little bit more expansively, but I think in this same way that technology is accelerating and the way that the effects that has on, for new materials, as well as just understanding of systems and processing, our codes and standards are also sort of seeing some of that. And this update is one of the most expansive and substantive, I think, that I've seen, at least since my time.
Gabe, as a practitioner, one of the things that keeps my team busy is that we're 3D scanning buildings around the world, from homes to schools and hospitals and everything in between. And what's really exciting is we're coming to a conclusion that as a result of 3D scanning a space, converting that into a standardized 3D model that's inclusive of the architectural systems, equipment systems, mechanical systems, and presumably modeled with a kind of a sub-inch level precision, we're starting to get kind of really accurate background information across buildings, which then begs the next question. Well, if we have a really good, solid digital representation of a building, if we could have a machine pull code, right, via API, there's a world here where this information starts to almost like auto-assess if an existing structure complies or is not compliant with existing code, et cetera. I know before this interview, you talked about one of the many things on your mind is the impact of AI. It suggests that in addition to now writing code for humans, you're also needing to somehow make this machine readable as well. And talk to me. What can we expect? What are some of the maybe most exciting efforts you're working on that starting to kind of unlock the ability for humans, machines to read this and really see a future where we're actually kind of scaling this thing?
Yeah, and that's super exciting, the work that you're doing. And I think we want to be in a place where we are facilitating technological advancements that support sort of the building safety ecosystem to do things, better or faster. I think so. I I'll talk to you a little bit about a couple things that we're doing, both sort of from a product side, but also from sort of an educational side that I think is relevant to what you're talking about. We use technology like AI to help our members and code officials, practitioners sort of better use codes and standards in their jobs in the field. Faster answers, better access. I think something that's important to us is that technical subject matter experts sort of be involved in developing that content, that humans are in the loop. They are critical towards ensuring these answers are accurate and that they're well informed. That's what makes tools trustworthy. And particularly when it comes to building codes and building safety, the life safety question, not some of these AI models sort of can operate on a continuum. And so if your accuracy rate is 90%, that sounds really great. But, I don't know that in, 100 answers, it would be acceptable to have, 10 life safety screw ups, from sort of an AI engine. The way that we've sort of, we've looked at this, I think, through an AI tool it is cabined to just looking at our codes and standards, our commentary materials. Again, it is pressure tested by our technical experts. So it's called our AI Navigator, and it answers questions about our codes. It's our most popular feature on our website. It's answered 130,000 questions correctly so far, and we have a next gen forthcoming. We are working with a number of AI companies working on products to facilitate development. In those, we will through an API provide sort of direct access to our codes and standards, because having sort of accurate content is critical. And so in the same way that if you do sort of if you leverage sort of a generalized AI chat, you're looking through a lot of information and it's doing the best it can to sort of to respond to. But if there's misinformation out there, that's going to sort of show in the response. So if we cabin our responses through our generator just to sort of source material, the responses sort of benefit from that. If you are an AI developer, ensuring that you're pulling what are actually the requirements, that's really important. So that's a way that we facilitate it. And we also, and I mentioned this given some of the work that you're doing, we will work with software providers to essentially sort of audit their software. And so we'll make sure that it is accurately reflecting the codes and standards that it purports to be conducting a review against, for example. So we've done that as well. The other thing I'll say is, I think our members are looking at a number of these solutions. At this point, most of our members are using some amount of sort of online products and services. They're using online plan review. So it's not paper-based anymore. A lot of that started to change with COVID. They're enabling scheduling to be done for a permitting inspection online. You can pull a permit online. You can receive a permit. You can pay your fees online. Those are all important things to sort of facilitate smoother transactions and sort of faster development. They're also, and this is, it's starting to get towards some of the work that you're doing. About a quarter of our members are using remote virtual inspections. Tends to be for certain types of things. Some of our members are doing drone inspections. And so there are absolutely opportunities in this space to speed development safely. I think that, for us, the key is, we want to be embracing technology where we can. We need to be resourced to do it. A lot of these departments, and I think this might have been one of the original reasons we got connected, is, departments are facing these pressures to turn permits around faster, but they're not being provided with staffing to do that, or they're being told that their processes are too slow and they're too clunky, but they're not being provided with resources to move to a technological platform. And so I think as in the AEC community, you all can be terrific allies for your partners sort of on the other side of the permit desk to say, look, like we want this to be done faster, but But applying sort of an arbitrary shot clock to how quick something needs to happen without providing any additional investment to a department that's already struggling is not going to solve their problem. And so I think, just a message to kind of, the broader sort of listener network here is if you can support those folks, they can help turn stuff around faster. And if it's a case where the support's been provided and there's still issues, let's worry about that down the road. But those investments are critical towards seeing a permitting department as nimble and technology enabled as I think the AEC community wants them to be.
That's super, super interesting. And gosh, so much there. Gabe, this has been an incredible primer for those listening in on the state of the code, where we've been, where we are. I have an incredible deep respect for, I think, the work that you're doing, your team is working on. For those that want to follow your work, obviously stay close. Where should they, connect with you, your team, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can absolutely connect with us on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. Our broader team is on LinkedIn. Our website is iccsafe.org. For folks that are interested in additional sort of resources around codes and affordability, that's iccsafe.org/affordability. For folks that are interested in talking to us about software that they have and ways that we could help vet it out, or they're interested in sort of engaging with us in that way, they can check us out at iccsafe.org/expert-services. And then for folks that are interested in our digital codes, it's just codes.iccsafe.org.
Amazing. Can't wait for part 2. Thanks, Gabe.
All right. Thanks so much.